Hello, good morning. Welcome to Melody Joy Quilts. I have the pattern Quadrangle here from Moda, and I also have this beautiful jelly roll from Moda as well called Berry and Pine, and I have been itching to get this thing opened and start working with it. It's all beautiful Christmas colors, and I think that the Quadrangle pattern, which kind of resembles a plaid, will be so pretty. Again, I'm using Berry and Pine. This is the jelly roll. I received this a few months ago for my birthday, and I have been patiently, or maybe not so patiently, waiting for this moment to unwrap it and get into these fabrics and take a closer look at them. So Quadrangle is a free pattern from Moda, and it's going to use almost all of my strips. I need to pull out 6 strips that I'm not going to use. I need 36 strips total. And so I need to go ahead and pull out the strips that I'm not going to use. So I'm going to start going through this jelly roll, sorting it, and then I also need to pair up my fabrics. So I need to remove 6 strips that I don't want to use, and then I need to pick which strips I'm going to pair together. This jelly roll is Christmas colors, and it has a lot of greens and reds. It's interesting that it does have a little bit of pinks and grays and even some light blues. So I'm sorting through what I wanted to keep in my quilt top. I'm going to use these strips in a little while to make some 4 patches. So these need to be sorted into contrasting sets of colors. And what I decided to do was kind of pull out the very lightest ones, because in the Quadrangle pattern, the sashing is light colored, and I have a white fabric that has little tiny green and red dots. It's just really cute, like a low volume fabric for my sashing strips. So I think the strips that are kind of on a white background are not going to create as much contrast. So I'm pretty much going to keep the greens and reds and remove the really lightest strips out of this jelly roll. This strip right here is a white on white pattern. It almost just looks like a plain white. It's very hard to even see the pattern on it. It doesn't look super Christmassy, so I'm going to go ahead and pull that one out. And again, some of these other ones that are just mostly white and they're just reading as not very patterned, I'm pulling those out. I thought this jelly roll came with 42 strips, but I ended up having to go back later and pull 2 out of my reject pile to make another strip set to have enough for my quilt top. So I think there may be an error in the Quadrangle pattern, possibly. Now it's kind of the fun part. I'm going through my colors and patterns and just trying to play around with what I think looks nice together, because each of these jelly roll strips is going to have one paired with it to make strip sets. So there's not really a right or a wrong, but just that your 4 patches need to have contrast. I'm trying to imagine what it's going to look like when it all comes together. Ultimately, most of these strips are going to make it into the quilt, but I'm just right now trying to see, do my colors sort of go Once you have finalized your sorting of your strips and you've removed the ones you don't want to use, which in this case for me was all the white and gray ones, you're going to next take your strips, and they're folded in half. That's how they come out of the jelly roll. You're going to cut them in half, and so then you're going to take your strip sets and go ahead and sew them together. So I need to make sure I have a 1/4 inch foot on, and I have my stitch length at 2.5, and I'm going to pick up my 2 strips that have been cut in half, and I'm going to lay them right sides together, and I'm going to sew down one long side to create a strip set. And I'm going to do this with all of my pairs. These prints are so pretty, and they're just a little bit different than your standard Christmas prints. I think it's that mix of a little bit of pink in there, but it's really pretty. So I'm just laying them right sides together, sewing down one long side, and I'm trying not to pull or stretch, but just feed it through as evenly as I can. Okay, let me move some of this a little closer to where I'm working. I've got all these sorted into the sets of 2. I think one of the fun things about quilting is that you have so much free will to play with patterns and colors. Even if you did the exact same quadrangle pattern and you used the same jelly roll as me, our quilts would end up looking different just because how you pair your colors up would probably be different than the choices that I made. I'm just ironing this open. So it makes this lovely little strip set, and you're going to repeat that with the matching one, and so you will end up with 2 sets that are identical, and you're going to use these, you're going to subcut these down, and you're going to use these strip sets to make your 4 patches. So if you started with 2.5 inch strips and you sewed 2 of them together, your strip set should be measuring 4.5 inches across. I'm now going to subcut this strip every 2.5 inches. So I'm going to subcut this right now. So I'm going to be left with a piece that's basically 2.5 by 4.5. I'm going to cut this entire strip set into 2.5 inch slices, and these are what I'm going to use to make my 4 patch. I will put 2 of these together, alternating dark and light, put them right sides together, and I'm just going to keep going. I'm going to slice every 2.5 inches. I'm going to put those 2 pieces together, alternating dark and light fabrics, and then sew my 4 patches. I did try to press towards the darker fabric, whichever fabric in my strip set I thought was the darker one, and this will make it really easy to nest up my seams in a minute. This pattern is great because you're left with very little waste. I had these little tiny pieces trimmed off the end, but this is a very low waist quilt, which is great. Once you sew them together, you're going to iron it open, and you're going to end up making a whole bunch of these little 4 patches, and these are what are going to go in later to make your blocks. So you need 4 patches for each block. So I just need to continue on making the 4 patches. I'm going to take these 2 pieces that are cut to 2.5 inches by 4.5 inches, lay them right sides together, nest up those seams, and sew down one side with a 1/4 inch seam. This is a very repetitive pattern. You do the same motions over and over again. So for each set of strip sets, you're going to do the same thing. Sew your 2 strips together, subcut to 2.5 inches, sew them into 4 patches. And each block needs 4 matching 4 patches. Jelly rolls are fun to sew with because it already comes, you get a variety of fabric already cut to 2.5-inch strips. So it saves you quite a lot of time on cutting up front, and you can open your jelly roll, create your pairs of 2 fabrics, and immediately get into sewing. So if you just want to hop right into a sewing project with a jelly roll, this is a great one because you can get started right away. You could also probably speed this up by pre-cutting all of these, but I did it in this method. I got my next set of 2, I cut them in half on the fold, put them right sides together, sewed them. This was just the method that I was working with. I probably could have pre-cut all the strips ahead of time, but I just went with the flow. Once you have a lot of these strip sets sewn together and you've ironed them out flat, ironing towards the darker seam, a way to speed up your cutting is to lay them right sides together the same way you would in the 4-patch. Then when you cut it every 2.5 inches, they're already laid so that you can just immediately pick them up and start sewing because they already have the fabrics where they should be. So when you open that up, it's the way it should be for the 4-patch. So the seams should already be nested up. You can nest them up on your cutting board, right sides together, cut every 2.5 inches, and then they're immediately ready to be sewn. This is what I started doing for the whole rest of the quilt. I think I was about 2 or 3 strip sets in when I realized this would be faster, and then I transitioned over to this method. You should be getting 8 of these sets out of each strip set. So you should end up with 8 matching 4-patches. And you need that because each of these strip sets should end up making 2 quilt blocks. And each quilt block is going to have 4 patches. So you need to make sure that you're lining your fabrics up in such a way that you can get 8 2.5-inch cuts out. And you should be able to do that. There's a little bit, like maybe 1.5 inches wiggle room. So you do need to be a little careful with your cutting so you can get 8 complete cuts across it. This pattern really lends itself to chain piecing because once you have those cut and you could have a lot of piles on your cutting board, it's really easy to just chain piece them into the 4 patches. It's another beautiful day for quilting. I made several of these quadrangle blocks using those 4 patches. You add sashing and a cornerstone, and it's 4 patches, your sashing and cornerstones, and it's just such a fun pattern. And I've made each block looks different but is yet very similar. Okay, so that was a little preview of what the blocks are going to end up looking like. Now let's build one together. You need to take 4 matching 4 patches. You also are going to they need to have the same color pointing towards the middle. Then you're going to need 4 pieces of your sashing. The sashing, there's instructions in the pattern of how to cut it, but this part of the sashing is 1.5 inches by 4.5 inches. Your cornerstone in the middle of your block is 1.5-inch square. So now you're going to sew a piece of sashing onto 2 of your 4 patches, and you're going to sew your cornerstone to one of the pieces of sashing. We're going to build this block. It comes together really easily. It's all straight seams. There's no diagonals, there's no half square triangles, there's no stitch and flip. It's very easy, straightforward sewing. When you iron, you want to iron everything towards the sashing. This is going to help it nest up really easily and keep your lines looking sharper. When you lay it back on your table, make sure you still have the same colors pointing towards that center cornerstone. And you're just going to flip that next row over and again just sew down the side. And then when we press, we will again press it towards the sashing. Now right here in the center of the block is where I try to be very careful with nesting those seams up so that as much as possible I have really good clean lines across the center of my block. This quilt to me ends up looking somewhere between like an Irish chain and a plaid. If those two patterns had a baby, that's what I think of quadrangle, because there's some diagonal lines and it also resembles a little bit of a plaid. I just love this pattern. I'm giving it another good thorough pressing, and that is a finished quadrangle block. Once you've made all your 4 patches and you've put all your 4 patches together into your blocks, the next thing to do is to add your sashing that's going to go in between your blocks to form your row. So this sashing strip is cut 1.5 inches by 9.5 inches. That should be the measurement. Your finished blocks should be coming out to 9.5 inches. And so your sashing strips that go in between your blocks in the row should be 9.5 by 1.5 inches. Again, you're always going to press it towards the sashing. If your blocks came out a little wonky, it's okay. Just take a ruler and your rotary cutter and just trim it up as best as possible to the 9.5 inches. If you can't get it to 9.5 inches, you could possibly trim it to 9.25 and then just make your sashing strips shorter. But you want to make sure that all your blocks are the consistent size. And that should be coming out to 9.5 inches squared. Each row of this quilt will end up being 6 blocks wide with 5 sashing strips in between, starting and ending with a block. In between each row of blocks, you're going to have more of those sashing strips that are the 1.5 inches by 9.5 inches, but you're also going to have more of those cornerstones. I chose dark green for my cornerstones, and they are cut to 1.5 inches. And so your sashing strips in between your rows of blocks are going to be 6 sashing strips plus 5 cornerstones. And so you have to make a bunch of these as well. And for everything in this quilt, you want to iron it towards your sashing strips. That'll just make it really easy to nest up your seams and then later even nest up your rows. And one way I figured out to speed up this process was the strips are long enough that you can take the tail end of the one you just sewed and kind of loop it around, grab your next piece, lay it right sides together, and by kind of looping it back and forth like this, you can just make one long continuous train. And that makes it really easy to make that long sashing row. When you pull this off, it kind of has a fun little almost like ruffled effect, but just snip your threads in between and then just iron it all towards the sashing, and you've got the whole row done in one go. I need to add 3 more blocks, but you can see how this is going to end up going together with your block row and then your sashing row. And I think the dark green cornerstones are working out well. I feel like sometimes I've seen coloring sheets for quilt patterns. I've never pre-colored one coloring sheet to try to see, or some people use computer programs to try to see what the entire quilt is going to look like before they begin. It's always a mystery to me when I start a quilt. I never have any idea really what it's going to end up looking like. I have a rough idea because of my fabric choices, but I haven't fully visualized it. I know there's some computer programs or coloring sheets that can let you really work the whole thing out ahead of time, but I kind of like just flying by the seat of my pants and seeing what happens. I am taking a second to peek underneath and make sure that I am really centered up so that my line that goes down the center, that sashing strip, is lined up with the center of my next block. Because this is a very geometric pattern, the closer to square that you can get it, the better it's going to look. I definitely had a little wonkiness in my finished quilt, but I was trying to be as cautious as I could to keep things lining up as well as possible. And some of this, I'm not sure if other people would even notice, but you know, when you're that close to a project, you can see every single little imperfection. I need 6 blocks for this first row, so I'm just auditioning here and I think this looks nice. So sashing strip, sew these together. I'm almost done with this first row. You could throw some pins or clips on here. I did not pin or clip when I was only working with the sections that were 9.5 inches long. Later, when I go to join my rows together, I used a lot of clips. Okay, this is the first row done. I just need to do this 5 more times. This is where I started to clip or pin, and I like to use these little like wonder clip types. They're very easy to take on and off, and what I did was I started from the cornerstone where it lined up with the sashing. I didn't start from the edge, I started from where the cornerstones are, and I made sure that that part was nested up, and it should nest really nicely. And as I went down the row, I clipped at every single cornerstone and sashing. I do feel like taking time to pin or clip on these long rows is well worth the effort for getting a cleaner result. It was at this point I realized I made my sashing strip one section too long. So no worries, I got out my handy dandy little seam ripper. He's my buddy, and sometimes he has to come out on projects. I somehow miscounted when I was chain piecing all of that, so that's okay. That piece and cornerstone will go into my next sashing row. I'll just set it to the side for now, and it was pretty easy to seam rip that extra section off, and now it's lining up perfectly. Okay, now I just need to sew down that long side. I loved this berry and pine jelly roll. One of the blocks that my hand is on right there, it's actually lyrics to "Oh Christmas Tree," and there was lyrics printed on green fabric, and they also had it on red and they had it on gray. But there's musical lyrics, there's flowers, there's little geometric designs, there's holly berries. It's just it's a little bit different than some of the Christmas fabrics I've seen before, but I really liked it. It also had poinsettias in it. I just really liked all the fabrics. Always a good idea to add a little back stitch at the end of your rows. Okay, time to iron this out. Again, we're going to keep ironing always to the sashing. That's row 1 of 6 done. Okay, here you can see I've been continuing with making lots of rows. I made it to where I had 2 sets of 3 rows, and then I laid those together. And so instead of going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, I did 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and then I took the 2 sections of 3 rows and matched them up. Again, same method, every single cornerstone and sashing intersection, I took time to clip, and this is just to ensure as much as possible that the lines will be continuing on in agreement with each other across the whole quilt. I found it easier to work in this method of doing half the quilt at a time. This is usually how I try to break up bigger quilts, is do half the rows from the top and then half the rows from the bottom, and then lay those two pieces on top of each other. It prevents so much bulk when you're sewing your rows together, in my mind at least. This is the final seam of this quilt top, and then I am going to add borders. Now the pattern tells you to use your sashing strips, the same fabric as your sashing for your borders, but I actually had ran out of that, but I did have a lot more of the dark green fabric left that I had used for cornerstones. So I ended up deciding to make my borders dark green. Okay, I've got all 6 of my rows sewn together, measuring it now for the borders, and I went with 2.5-inch strips of the same dark green that I used for the cornerstones. This does make a square quilt, but it is a generous square, and I love that it kind of looks like a plaid, and it also kind of looks like a chain. My background fabric has those little tiny green and red dots, and I loved on the salvage it says, so they sprinkled polka dots throughout their quilts. I just love this quilt. It just looks very Christmassy to me. I managed to get my husband to help me pose with the quilt so I could try to get some better pictures of it. This is the top. I've still got to pick a backing. I'm thinking right now some type of either minky or flannel, so it will be a nice warm Christmas quilt. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit the like button, subscribe for more, hype it, and let me know what you're sewing for Christmas this year. Happy quilting!